then all of a sudden the art world decided, oh, okay, we don't like that kind of art anymore now. What we like is we like conceptual art. And like in Gober's case, he made a bag of donuts, and so it suddenly became worth all this money. But Edward Brezinski came along, and he walked into this gallery and he saw these donuts sitting there, right? And he heard how much they were worth, so he's like, well, I want to know if they taste good too, right? So he's gonna buy
Yeah.
it, right? And
Yeah,
then
with
he was
also the
right.
attitude like fuck this gallery.
Yeah, exactly. 'Cause
Yeah.
he was kind of like a Five Easy Pieces character, in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah, like a Jack Nicholson guy.
Today on the show, we are joined with Brian Vincent, who is the co-creator of the documentary Make Me Famous. Make Me Famous takes a deep dive of the Lower East Side of New York City right into the underground art scene. And what was going on there was so fucking punk rock and shaped the art scene as a whole. And Brian took the time to shine a light on some of these untold legends. And speaking of untold legends, big narrative around this film goes around a man named Edward Brezinski. And what is so cool about this doc, around making you feel that you're right there in the 80s, in the mix of all the grit and glam that's going on. This guy Edward was the main focus of it. And years down the line, a friend informed their community that Edward has passed away. But if you look into the obituaries and news reports, there wasn't a record of him being deceased, to the point it was speculated Edward Brezinski has faked his own death. Because he seems like the type of guy who would fucking do that. And my boy Brian, who's on the show today, also uncovered that mystery, well, telling this whole story of the Lower East Side art scene in the 1980s. So cool. And even around that, I feel like this conversation has fueled an extra fire of my artistic and creative side. And I think this is a great episode to anyone who's pursuing their passions, whether you're a musician, filmmaker, writer, etc., etc. I feel like you can get something out of the spirit of the film and the spirit of Edward Brezinski, the spirit of Brian, and the spirit of the people in the Lower East Side of New York who are just doing it because this is what they do. This is what their passion is. This is what they unconsciously do when they wake up in the morning, and just never giving up even when you're struggling at being an artist. I feel like everybody looks for the fame, and maybe it's not even for the attention. It's to have the funding to do what you need to do. But a lot of these people, they've stuck it out, and maybe they didn't realize at the time that they are absolute legends for shaping the scene, whether people know their name or not. But Brian did an excellent job at shining the light on them. And once again, I just love this talk. So let's get into this one with Brian Vincent of Make Me Famous.
Hey, how you doing, Sean?
Hey, great, Brian. How you doing today?
Excellent. Glad to be here.
Yeah, great to meet you, man. Excited to pick your brain. Obviously, we're here to talk about Make Me Famous, but also one thing I really loved about this film too is just the clash between documenting a part of time and also around following this journey of a person and like his interesting story and all that too. And I kind of just really want to get into like what inspired you to bring this to life, because obviously you're really close to the scene that happened throughout like the 80s in New York and everything. But yeah, it's cool that you brought it to life, and I kind of want to know like how this came to be.
Yeah, I'm happy to share that. This piece started as a play, actually. I was thinking about making a play that would be really interesting. I like to create things that I'm in. And so I originally started interviewing all these people thinking I was going to write a play. But then there was all these incredible stories about Edward Brezinski. And in a play, you tend to concentrate on one moment, right? And then you kind of unspool that. Whereas in this case, it really ended up being that there were all these stories that kind of added up to one thing. And on top of that, there's this incredible archival that we discovered, and that had to be seen. But anyway, so I'm not of the 80s scene. I was too young to be here then, but I was totally fascinated by that time period because of all the great artists that came out of then. And also because when I delved deeper into it, when I looked into like what created this scene, it was sort of like a bunch of people. I mean, just hundreds and hundreds of people, really, that all banded together, and they rented storefronts as the city was completely broke and it was dangerous. And the only place where the artists could afford to live was like the most dangerous of all.
Yeah. Yeah. You know what's really cool too? I learned a lot like throughout this movie too about that group of people who do more like visual arts and stuff. But one thing I'm really into is old school hardcore music. And this one band from around there, they always talk about the Lower East Side in 80s. So I feel like this just kind of gave me like a different look of maybe another subsection of just grit and passionate people almost doing it because this is just what they do. They're creatives and almost just make these tight-knit communities that are just super special.
Yeah, that's really the hammer on the nail there. It there wasn't a lot of money to be made then, and so there wasn't this dream of I'll become a rich artist. It if you were doing it, it was because you loved doing it, and they were too young then to get their stuff into the galleries, because the galleries, they were all kind of like looking for earthworks and kind of strange things that had nothing to do with painting, right? So these young people, they got together and they sort of performed for each other, but they didn't just like go, oh, let's do a gallery show. They do like, oh, how about like, you play some music and I'll hang up paintings, and we'll do photography, and then we'll take pictures of each other, and then we'll perform. Like Eric Bogosian will just do monologues. And so there was this explosion of creativity, but the goal was to be the most creative person.
Mm-hmm.
And so like everybody was from what I gather anyway, from all the research, they were all pushing each other to go further in that way. And then all of a sudden a few of them became famous and they became rich. And it was like the because they had created all this great artwork, it changed the whole art scene. And all of a sudden, everybody wanted Basquiat, Jean-Michel Basquiat, who was just kind of hanging around and making all these paintings and tearing off a refrigerator door and making a painting on it and stuff. All of a sudden, that became worth a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
And that changed the whole scene up. And, of course, then people were picking up video cameras. But back then, if you had a video camera, it weighed like, 40 pounds, and it was huge. Right. So like, up until that point, everything they were doing down in the Lower East Side, it was kind of invisible. Right. And so they'd make a show and it would be stellar and people talk about it for years, but it wasn't recorded. Right. So all of a sudden, though, everybody wanted to chase the fame dream. And, Madonna, who was performing in Danceteria, all of a sudden she takes off. And, there's numerous other people too, like Keith Haring blew up. And there was Edward Brezinski, and he was trying to make it too. And so what happened was, I'm an actor, and sometimes, I'm out of work, right? As actors can be. And so I was doing a waiter job. Right. And I had been delving into the 1980s art scene. Like I reading all these books, and I loved going to the museums in New York and just checking out all this incredible art. But anyway, so I was working, and I told you know, this other waiter that I'd been really into the 1980s art scene. And it turned out that this was Lenny Kisco, who's in the movie, and he was a collector. And you know, Brezinski, he tells me, this guy, I used to collect him all through the 80s. And he says, Brezinski used to complain. He used to say, oh, my main benefactor is a waiter. That's my life, you know?
Yeah.
And I could totally relate. And I thought that was funny and cool. And so I had to go see this art. And when I went to go see this art, Lenny lives in like this railroad apartment that he's had since the 80s. And every square inch of his apartment is covered in a painting by Brezinski.
So
And
cool.
yeah, he was just the way he was, like kind of Gollum, you know, with my precious, and he was like, and I saw it too. I was looking at the art and I was like, this is great. How could this guy not have gotten famous? And so that's when the inspiration hit and the research began. And I went into the communities of the people that were still left from the 80s, and they're still doing all their shows. So
That's amazing.
yeah, they still
Yeah.
perform for each other, and the spirit is still alive with them. They're so fun that way, and so that's how I got to know them, and had really intimate friendships with some of them, like Richard Hambleton, who's also from Canada. He's from Vancouver. He is called the Godfather of street art, right? And he I had met him at a memorial for an art critic and in 2014, and he had heard that I was interested in Brezinski. He came running over and handed me like his phone number and all this, and then he sort of disappeared on me. It took me years to get a hold of him, and when I did, he was like so he was in like this interesting state where he wanted me to help him, assist him paint and like assist him while he painted. So I got to know these people like over years and years of this kind of stuff before we even did the interviews.
Oh, cool. That's awesome. And I really appreciated that you said that they still like just rock these shows now too. And that's like just the sign of a true artist where I don't know, it's beyond like trying to make it or whatever. You're just doing it because you do it. And I feel like that's where the most real and raw stuff comes out of, whether it's visual arts, filmmaking, music, all that, just because it's something in you and it's just you got to get it out because that's life, you know? And
Yeah, that's the pure stuff there, and that is still abounding with this group, and they're super excited about my interest in someone they hadn't thought about in many years. And especially because so many people, you know, scholars or documentarians or whatever, they want to know about Basquiat. They want to know about Keith Haring. And so this was like, oh, wow, Edward Brzezinski. Wow, you're really taking me back now. And
Mhm.
but they remembered Brzezinski fondly, not just for his art, which was always sort of pure because he wasn't selling it for a lot, but they also remembered that he went to all their shows.
Yeah. I
And
think
yeah.
yeah, something that's really cool too, like throughout the film and you showcasing Edward Brzezinski is that it seemed like whether people loved him or hated him, like there's no like argument like how integral of a part he was to that scene. And it's amazing.
Thank you. And really, it's an important thing because that's really what the movie's about. It really once I researched all this, and you say, well, look at all these artists that are now very famous that came from that era, but what about those other artists that were part of that scene too, and they're still out there doing it too, and you saw all these varying degrees of how the art industry, or like, I don't know how to describe it, the art market takes them, but they're still they're still out there doing this, you know, and like
Mhm.
you said, it's because they're born with this. They, like Richard Hamilton used to say, I got it in me. I have to get it out. I have to get this on canvas right now, you know, and so, you know, it makes you wonder, even, I guess, if the people that are so famous, you know, like, um how, if, you know, it makes you wonder if they'd still be doing it at the same level, and I think they would, if they didn't make it either. And I think you see that in the movie, even though people are really honest about how they felt about Edward as a person, um,
Mhm.
but that the respect they had for his getting up every day and making something, like, that's solid.
Yeah, it's amazing. And yeah, once again, I love how you captured this story too. And even there's a little like intriguing bit going on throughout it that I don't want to spoil the end conclusion in case somebody does not know the story of Edward Brezinski. But it almost like alongside you're showcasing like this scene in the 80s, but then it kind of turns into a bit of a mystery in a way, whether Edward faked his own death or not, which I don't know, that's kind of like such a cool like subplot like going on throughout, like educating us about this scene as well.
Yeah, you know, Edward was a rascal,
Yeah.
but they saw the way that they behaved and presented themselves as an additional way of performing their art, and that continues to this day. Like, you'll see in the movie, you know, there's a couple of gentlemen who still dress from a different century, and part of what they're putting forward is a persona. And so Edward, I learned about all this, though, without really knowing, going into it at all, about Edward at all. I was just really inspired by his art. And so the only thing that was on the internet when I first started was Edward was in the Brooklyn Museum. He had a nice painting there. And there was also a story. There were a number of stories all over the place about Edward Brezinski eating another artist's artwork.
Yeah.
And you know, that was just so fascinating to me, that Edward had just these few little stories, and they were really interesting things. But what else was there? And
Mhm.
so, as we researched, which took years and years, I realized what a rascal Edward could be. And though he has this obituary, I came to find out he wasn't on the Social Security master death file here in the United States, which you have to be on if you're dead.
Yeah.
And so this intriguing story about how Edward Brzezinski died became more interesting, and especially because it all spools through his gallery friends and who supported and showed Edward. And so unspooling that story was a lot of fun, and it required also the other artists coming to the Côte d'Azur, and us all doing it together, which we figured it out in real time, and it's in the movie.
Yeah, that's amazing too, especially just documenting that and filming all that. And even I was so impressed too, like you mentioned, back in the 80s, cameras were really big. It wasn't common to carry them around, but the amount of footage you have of these galleries, it almost like feels like you caught this in real time and planned to make this movie with that too. Because again, like it showcases a lot of like Edward's character and like turns into like little subplots, and you can like kind of like really see like what's happening in that period of time and in his apartment, and with the people involved who you also interview. They're all there in this footage in the 80s too. And like, how did you go about like mining all that? Did one person just, was it like one guy documenting all this, or was like a bunch of them? Like, because it's so impressive.
Thank you. Well, I have to give the credit to Brzezinski himself and his friend Jim C., who's a videographer, who was getting his PhD and came down to New York City from upstate. He was getting his PhD in art, and he realized that the 1980s art scene was the most exciting possible thing he could be filming. And so he took his student loan money and he started filming the Lower East Side. And Brezinski, who was always forward thinking, he asked Jim to film his openings across the street from the men's shelter up on the 5th floor walk up. And you know, that's what helps the audience to feel like they're living there. And I can't tell you how excited I was when we found that. And Jim C, who's this, like, you know, incredible guy, lives in Woodstock. But when I reached out to him, he said, you know, I don't know. I think I'm going to make a documentary about Brezinski someday. And so I was really bummed, as I was like, oh, wow, I don't think I can make this movie without it, Jim. And then about a year later, I get a call from him and he says, oh, I had this terrible dream. Brezinski came in my dream and he said, you will work with Brian and you will let him use this for the movie. And so he's been a sweetheart ever since. But you know, so that's how that came about. But Jim just kept feeding me hours and hours of this material. And in fact, he had somewhere near 100 hours of it. And between the interviews, which the interviews became the way to tell his career and his life story, the most important aspect of that generally was that they were also in the archival. And the way that eventually the movie got structured, it was structured all the way through his obituary. And the reason that I did that was because the obituary tells the important stories of his career. And luckily, because they're filmed, then we can live them with him. But eventually, I take the obituary and question its validity itself, so that the structure of the movie sort of looks inward and then kind of explodes on itself, you know, and then becomes real time. So anyway, that the archival is just genius, and I got to hand it to Brezinski. I mean, he thought about it ahead of time. Boy, I should be filming myself, and that's what he did.
Yeah, that's magic that you got all that footage and that he did that too, and especially just putting it together, like that had to be really hard to like go through it and decide what am I going to put in to almost progress the story and all that, which you did like such a great job with as well.
Thank you for that. Yeah. The editing is just a whole other aspect of it, because once you get good stuff, you just want more good stuff, and then you end up going, wow, you know, how can I tell this story so that the audience feels like they're there, and also that they are they're learning something. Anina Nosei, who's the Italian woman in the movie, she was Basquiat's first gallerist. She told me after she saw the movie, she came over to me and she said, you made art history fun. And that was like, wow, that was like the greatest compliment for me. Because when you're editing something, and it's really more like a novel when it's a feature than it is anything else. It has 3 acts, and it's meant to, around, you know, around the 70th minute, to find a very surprising plot point turnaround. And so I tried to fit it into the structure of movies in a way, in that way. But it's almost like cheating when you have this much good archival.
Yeah, that's awesome though. Yeah, I'm sure there's like almost like a point where you're editing and you like certain scenes or some things he said too, but you got to like cut it for the sake of the story and pushing the documentary forward and everything.
Yeah, that kills you. That's the hardest thing in the world. My wife is very good at telling me when something's not working, though. So so I
Yeah.
have that.
Yeah. Well, you probably could take the extras and maybe make like a YouTube channel or something, like just call it like classic 80s like New York art or something, and just because this is like so rare to even see footage like this. And one thing I just really appreciated about their lifestyle of that scene too is like you mentioned, like Edward's apartment was across from a men's shelter, which is just a place with homeless and just drugs, people sleeping on the street. And but he also, like, as he was doing his art and setting up his own gallery, it seems like there was a bit of glam to it in a strange way, in a gritty way, like just how they kind of like put pride in hanging up their work and then having these parties with drinks and inviting specific people to see their stuff and sell their work. And I just thought that was just so cool, and it's almost like a story of making the most of what you have. I i i, I meet a lot of different creatives, and sometimes they feel a little self-conscious of not always having maybe the best space or funding, or like a videographer doesn't have the newest camera, but you can honestly make magic with what you have now, and like just by putting that energy into it.
Yeah, that's exactly the thing that I think inspires the most people about this era. All of these young people, though, are, or I should say, most of these young people of the 80s were very trained. They had been to art school and they had spent years training it. Richard Hambleton, for instance, he had spent many years uh, studying art before he came to New York and just stunned the city with his street art that changed the world. And the same goes with these young people. They were so highly trained, and so they were entertaining each other with things that I think they didn't think would end up in museums or anything. I mean, they were making their own posters and they were performing for each other, and they just kept pushing each other. Like Eric Bogosian said, like you could do it more, you could be more creative, like, and until it just sort of exploded. And this video that we have, this great archival, shows you the incredible lengths they went to make each thing and each show like a stunning one of a kind deal. And so that's what a lot of people remember about this time period. I mean, all of a sudden, though, everybody wanted a piece of that. And that went on for about 7 or 8 years, and then AIDS hit, and AIDS just decimated these wonderful young people, and they started dying around 1983, but it got really bad in 85 or so, and around 89, 88, when a lot of this had been hollowed out. Obviously they weren't going to all be hanging out, kind of like with we have COVID now, and obviously, and people don't get together as much as they used to, and AIDS did the same thing to them. And then all of a sudden the art world decided, oh, okay, we don't like that kind of art anymore now. What we like is we like conceptual art that's all just like, like Koons, or something like that. And I, don't get me wrong, I like Koons. I love the dog and I love all the things he does. But Robert Gober, like they make a piece of like a wood or something made out of something else, and you walk into the gallery and you go, well, what is that? What does that mean? And like in Gober's case, he made a bag of donuts, and so it suddenly became worth all this money. But Edward Brezinski came along, and he walked into this gallery and he saw these donuts sitting there, right? And he heard how much they were worth, so he's like, well, I want to know if they taste good too, right? So he's
Yeah.
right. And
Yeah,
then
with
he was
also the attitude like, fuck this gallery.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
He was kind of like a Five Easy Pieces character, in a way.
Yeah.
Like a Jack Nicholson guy. But then later those donuts they sold for 250 grand, like just like a few years later. So, you know, Gober should be doing, you know, he should be celebrating Brezinski, you know. But his style of painting didn't really come back until just recently. Like people now, they love Basquiat, but like 5, 6, 7 years ago when I was doing this project, there was still a lot of people going, I don't know if it's that good.
Oh, wow. It's almost like these fat, or like in a way, like art turns into like fads for certain people. Like they try to like, I don't know, there's like a boom where they're like, this is in now and this isn't. That was like yesterday, and like moving
Exactly.
on. Like it's almost like music, which
Uh-huh.
is, I don't know, it's interesting for me too, because I haven't dove deep into the visual art world, but it's really cool to just see this presented to me in this film and everything. It just gave me extra layers of appreciation, and I'm even seeing it like coincide with different forms of art, just the type of people and the spirits. And even from that time, like I used the word grit, and like just how grimy a bit it was. You really feel it in the art, that especially like that Edward makes. Like you look at it and you have a feeling. And it makes me kind of think too, like as you mentioned too, he wasn't the most famous guy back in the day, but I wonder if he did got famous, would that affect his art too? Because it seems like his work was very emotional and reflected the place he was in at the time.
That's a great comment. And I would love to see that art where Edward felt successful.
Hmm.
He still managed though with his I guess I'd call it punk rock art, like classical punk or something, the way he painted, because he still, even though he's suffered a lot, like a lot of artists do, his art when you're around is it's pretty exciting, and it gives you a lot of joy. You know, so I don't really know how he would do that, and I would love to know, that's for sure. But like I said, all these guys and all these ladies and gentlemen of the 80s, they're out there still fighting the good fight. You know, they perform for each other still. And we had the great pleasure too of James Romberger and Marguerite Van Cook, who are in this movie as important subjects, also made original artwork for the movie. And I really wanted that because, first of all, James Romberger, he's one of the greatest artists that I've ever witnessed. He in his art is about is very realistic pastels that he makes, and often of the Lower East Side. And his work is in the Metropolitan Museum and whatnot. And his wife, Marguerite Van Cook, she does installations and things like that. So when there wasn't archival of Edward, then my dream or my hope was that the friends and the close people to Edward might make art that could help tell the story. And that's exactly what happens. Like, for instance, you see that in the AIDS section, and you'll see James Romberger made this incredible silhouette, and Marguerite Van Cook did this amazing installation of throwing wine. And Richard Hambleton also made incredible Shadow Man pieces. Richard was known as the Shadow Man. And Edward Brezinski, as his career went on, he became sort of a fringe character. And though we didn't have him in video anymore because he had moved to a different country, Richard Hambleton made shadow art that helped tell that story.
Yeah, that's actually some of the pieces I love the most in the watching the film The Shadow Men and stuff, because it's kind of cool, like for people who are listening. Just the style was kind of, it seemed like it was like spray painted on different brick walls outside, but if you were walking down that alley for like the first time in the middle of the night, like it's like something that could just like freak you out or like make you look over your shoulder for a moment too. And there's something I really appreciated about it. And I think even one person described it as like, oh, it's great work, but it's kind of like demonic, or I forget the word they used, but
Yeah, it's got a
super
bit of
cool.
evil in it, right?
Yeah, that was it. It's like it's got a bit of it's almost like it's just trolling the public in a way.
You know what? That's a really good, interesting thing to talk about too. Is that this art wasn't necessarily made to make, for your enjoyment too. It was. I guess I'm saying that in the wrong way. It had a element to it that wasn't afraid to have that kind of depth to it. To scare you even, or whatever it is, because Brezinski's style of art and the style of art that was really in at that time, it was emotional and it was supposed to be authentic.
Yeah, it was totally bold. And like I'd say, like I find some people when they create something, it could be a piece of art, like music, sometimes they'll try to pander to like a bigger audience, where I feel like a lot of the work you showcase in this movie didn't do that. It was more like, yeah, this is how I fucking feel today type of thing. And there's like something just so like honest and beautiful about that, even with like really dark paintings and stuff like that.
Yeah, and to catch that is a piece of history right there. Because what we see in today's art world, it seems to me, it pushes the young people into trying to find that money, success, and get to the right gallery and see if you can and start making that money. And as opposed to this artwork maturing and these artists maturing and making artwork that they could fail at, or that would be so unbelievably incredible, but no one knew about, like Basquiat. And all of a sudden they had to collect all of it because he had matured and he had been making art because that's what he had to do. I have to make art right now.
Yeah. Even you kind of showcase too, as some of these old buildings would like get torn down or whatever, just changed to different shops and stuff. These places where these artists were living, instead of people preserving this stuff, I don't know, just a big businessman comes in, just sees like a bunch of random shit, like thinks it's garbage. And a lot of this work from that time period is gone now, just you could probably dig through a landfill like or something, or just it's interesting how much stuff probably isn't archived or captured.
Oh yeah, there's still paintings underneath beds and in attics all over the place, I'm sure. And the Lower East Side has always been a place that attracted artists. In fact, at the turn of the century, that's where they went as well. And it's gone up and down. And the story, like a lot of other urban decay places, when the artists finally come in, it's usually because they can afford it. Nobody else wants to live there, and so people say, the artists have no money, so that's what I mean. And so they move in where there's no money, and then they start improving everything, and suddenly it becomes worth money because that's where you want to go. You want to go where all this fun stuff's going on, this hip stuff. I mean, some of this happened in Brooklyn in the last 15, 20 years. Brooklyn is now, it's so gorgeous, but back when I moved to New York in 1990, it wasn't. And, but people like Richard Hamilton and Keith Haring, they actually started a movement that has transformed societies all over the world because of street art. And people take this urban decay and then they make art on it, and it draws people to it, and then that neighborhood gets fixed. So there's a real healing going on there. There's a real healing that's important. But on the other hand, a lot of this art and the artists who do it and the trailblazers and the pioneers often get overlooked because there's only room in the spectrum of the media for a couple of artists. And if you don't get in on that golden nail, you may be chasing that for quite a while. But then there may come along someone like myself who's really interested in careers of people who are unknown artists, because I think it's telling a story that no one knows where you're going, right? Is so interesting.
Yeah.
And just so many there's so many documentaries about famous people, and in a documentary like that, you have to find something new, like about a famous person, and then you tell that story, and then it goes on a shelf with like 1,000 other movies about that famous person. But like, if you find somebody that's new but had devoted their life to art, like, you don't know what's going to happen. And what happened here with all of this investigating and what it turned into with this movie is it surprised me too. I'm really surprised. And I know that the community itself is real proud of it too. They come and join us on our social media. We are at Make Me Famous Movie on Instagram, and Make Me Famous Movie on Facebook, and Famous Art Doc on Twitter. But the community is really there on Instagram, and they communicate with each other, and they're really cheering our movie along. And a lot of these people moved on to have these incredible careers too. A lot of them in publishing, and because these are people who where their art shown the most, and it would they'd work in magazines and all kinds of other places that are helpful to us still with this movie. And so, like I said, the scene itself in the Lower East Side may be dead in some ways. There's a few pockets there, but those people, they're not retired yet. And some of them are still popping off right now, like Frank Holiday in our movie. The Guggenheim gave him a big grant recently, and Scott Covert is another guy who's got shows that are suddenly exploding. And so you get to see them suddenly become famous, and that's real nice. Like, same with Richard Hamilton. When I first got to know him, he had been famous, but then a documentary came out about him called Shadow Man, and all of a sudden he became famous again. And I was friends with him through the whole period of him suddenly becoming famous again, all of his art being worth gajillion dollars overnight. And so that's really fun. And so, like, you get this rock and roll feeling from the whole vibe, and because they're still out there playing.
Yeah, that's so cool. Like, even that's what I respect so much about it too, just them being about it. And even back in the day when they started too, like, they had no idea that they are literally legends doing this, even whether they became famous or not too. Like, they are a part of this bigger movement by being there and inspiring each other and just becoming like almost their own like ecosystem of art and inspiration and everything. And I think this is just so cool, Brian, that you took the time to piece it together, showcase it, because I do believe these people should be celebrated as well. And I feel like you're a very similar spirit to mine too. Like, even though once in a while, like, nowadays people see me get bigger guests, but when I started doing these interviews, I was just seeing some unknown stories in different scenes and stuff like that, of like some cool people that nobody heard about. And it's just like, why don't people know you? Or like, even in my mind, it's like, why isn't this person famous? And you even mentioned, like, in the art world, like, maybe one or two will get picked. It almost seems like it's like a lottery, and sometimes those people who do get picked, they're just as talented as the unknown, and there's just so many stories of people just working really hard, and their stories not being told. So lots of respect for you to even like go beyond the names in that scene, talk to people who were there underground and all that. I think that's just awesome, man.
Oh, thank you. I can relate to it, and that's really why it meant a lot to me to try to bring Brzezinski's story forward, because I'm an actor. I've been in a number of things off and on over the years, and I've also been unemployed over the years, and I've had to make my own projects as well. And I don't maybe I shouldn't say had to, because it's ended up defining who I am, and I want to make more of it. But I'm not a famous actor. That means that every time I go in for an audition, I got to beat out 200 people for some little thing, and that's hard to do over and over and over and over and over and over. And that's what these artists face as well. But like Eric Bogosian says in the movie, he says something great about the art world is that they wake up every day and they make something. And, whereas, sometimes I felt with the acting, I'm waiting for something to happen, or I'm working on an audition that goes away forever. But they do have a something on us there with the artists, because even if they're not famous and nobody's clamoring for what they're making yet, they're making something, and they're making the most creative thing they can make right there. And I think that's just great. And I think that's really important to check out. And I don't want to miss any, great stories out there in history. And so thank you for that. And that's something I'm going to keep doing. Actually, I have other artists as in mind, and I just want to bring them forward.
That's so awesome, and I respect that. Like I said, you're a similar soul in a way, except I picked up a camera and I got too lazy with it. I realized podcasting's way easier to tell a story, even though I do enjoy documentaries myself. But yeah, and again, like another thing to commend you on, just the amount of time that goes into making a great documentary. You're following people, and even as you start to, the whole thing isn't pieced together, and there's almost this unknown of whether the story is going to have like a conclusion to it, like you can keep going. And I've known people who worked on documentaries, sometimes they'll take a year, sometimes they'll take 8 years, just because it doesn't have that ending. Maybe they found something that's interesting going on, but it doesn't like piece together. It's so that had to be really interesting, and I'm really trying not to spoil the Edward plot as well, but
You haven't.
Yeah, that's cool that you ended up getting closure at the end to even tell that sub story within it.
Yeah, it I didn't know when I started, as you said. Even when I began the research, I didn't even know when we'd start filming. There came a day when I knew it was right to do it, because of how many things I now knew, and also because I knew that the obituary had become such an important aspect of it, and that's why I knew we could film. But I also knew that once we tracked down and figured out Brzezinski, the mystery, I knew that was likely going to have a kind of a closure to it. So we put that off as long as we could, and we wanted to see, what did the other artists think of that, and they were all excited to find out, and they had varying degrees, just like they did with the donut, because a lot of people thought that Edward had eaten that donut because he was drunk that night.
Yeah.
and other people thought that he'd done it because he was hungry, right?
Yeah, everybody's kind of got their own version of like what happened that night.
Yeah, right. And so that's something they love, and but it's interesting when you do a documentary and you've never met the person, you really get a sense of what a real person this is, and how that this is a real person, and that he has real family, and that his family didn't know what had happened to him either. And so also the other artists, he meant something to them, or he didn't mean a damn thing, or he he was talented, but he was an idiot, you know, and so they really wanted, what they wanted more than anything was to be truthful. And they wanted to hold me to that and not make this whole scene just sparkly and like it like it wasn't. And so it was a lot of responsibility. The more and more that we filmed and the more and more that we interviewed, to get it right.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it probably helped that Edward was like such a polarizing character, because it really shows that you're being truthful because of everybody's opinion being totally different. It's not like this movie has one agenda. As a viewer, you can watch it and you can decide whether you think he's a genius or a fucking idiot or whatever. It's there's some like layers of beauty in that as well.
Yeah, yeah. And Richard Hamilton, like I said, I assisted him while he painted paintings and things. And he used to say that it's up to the viewer, right? And he didn't want to say what something was or not. And one thing that he really helped me see was that mystery is a tool in your toolbox. And in a lot of ways, he said, you'll see a lot of films and art and whatnot where they tell you what it's all about as you're watching it. And he said, what a thing to miss out on when you do that. And Richard's pretty much his whole art was about mystery. And so he helped me have the patience to see that was important, and we should wait to figure out and see if we can solve some of these things, but also to keep the mystery always, and to let the viewer decide.
Yeah, that's so cool. Even you're making me think of some people I met over the years, and yeah, a musician friend of mine too. I think this is so, like you mentioned, the mystery is powerful as well. And with her music, she was saying like when she does interviews and stuff, she never really says or tells people what the songs mean. And she says, I write it and it means something to me. But she says like the best thing is when somebody comes up to you after the show and it talk about what it means to them and how they interpret it, whether it, and it's just in a way, she kind of mentioned it turned into like this accidental sociology experiment in a way of how like you can put something out there and people interpret it by their own feelings and just how they grew up or anything like lifestyle. And again, like that's what great art can do, visual art and movies and all that too.
Yeah, and that's something, I think that's very touching that she said that. It actually reminds me of, I I also wrote a song once with Randy Travis, okay? And because I like to write as well, and we were making a movie together, and we just happened to, Randy said, "Oh, I got to write a song for this movie we're doing. It's called Black Dog." And it was with Patrick Swayze. And he
Cool.
said, "Oh, listen to this song they want me to sing. It's like going down the road, black dog, black dog." He goes, "I can't sing this thing." He goes, "You want to try and write something?" And so we were just goofing around. And anyway, he said something I always remembered. He's he's I said, "Well, what do you think of these lyrics like this?" And it's kind of embarrassing though, I think. And he goes, "Well, a song is only good if it's embarrassing to sing." He said, "That's when I know it's good." And
Hmm.
and I try to remember that too when I made this movie, because of putting in the parts that were embarrassing to, for
Hmm.
Edward, and that's what makes it more honest. It's not a PR piece, it's a life exploration.
Ah, yeah. Yeah, just to have that vulnerability is, I believe vulnerability is real, and
Yeah,
yeah, and even the
yeah.
vibe I got from watching it too, it's a real and raw film, and I really enjoyed it. Yeah, thank you for making it too. I feel like any type of creative of any level, like whether you're a professional or just inspired to do something should watch this and just see that you can make a scene, you know, out of nothing, and just by doing it, and like make all these like amazing relationships and just stories in life and everything. It's yeah, it's a cool film, and I'm gonna continue to share it as whatever form you decide to release it in. I know it's coming out now as well, right?
Yes, right now it's at
yeah.
Hot Doc Cinema.
Yeah.
And it's playing tonight. It's playing all the way through February 1st. Hot Doc Cinema is a beautiful place, 650-seat theater. And this is the kind of movie where it's good to see it in a theater because you get a sense of the whole crowd, and they laugh along. And it was always intended, it was always edited, thinking about an audience in mind. So after this, we go to London. We're going to be at the Bertha Dock House for about a week, starting February 17th. And then the Museum of the City of New York is going to do a special screening of the movie in Moonlight and Movies on April 17th in New York City. So we have some very exciting places that it's showing. And hopefully we'll just keep hitting theaters until eventually we'll put it on video or streaming so everybody can see it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, that's gonna be so exciting that it's going to New York as well too, just because of how close knit it is. But yeah, definitely this needs to be on like a streaming service, because yeah, I just noticed like people just will watch like any type of documentary. Like I have friends telling me they're like so into documentaries they've ran out of them on Netflix. So like
yeah, right.
it's so
I
cool.
know.
Like the power of making a documentary to get people to look into different worlds that they might not even be connected to, and all that. And yeah, even before we go to, I want to just ask you, throughout this journey of making this, obviously it was intensive and even a learning experience and all that, but what is like one thing that maybe you took away after this? Like, is there something you learned about yourself or a filmmaker or anything like that?
Well, I'll say I learned that I have the greatest wife in the world. She is a producer as well as an actress. She was on Broadway and Wicked for many years, but I wouldn't be sitting here in front of you if it weren't for all the invisible strings that she's been pulling all along the way. And even though I edited the movie, we told the story together. There are just so many things that Heather Spore has done to make this movie get out there into the world, and her incredible stuff that she does on social media, on Instagram with Make Me Famous Movie. So I guess if there's one thing that I realized, it's I sure did get a great wife. I'm so lucky. And so we want to bring you all some more stories, and we're going to do that.
Nice. Yeah, and shout outs to Heather. I know she had a little cameo in the movie as well too. And yeah, people like that are important for creatives, you know? Like I don't know if you're like me, but like sometimes I'm all over the place even with like an idea or making something, and you need the person to have like the focus and like the scheduling and everything.
That's right.
It's so powerful.
It is, and Brezinski had Lenny, right?
Yeah.
So Lenny, the waiter that turned out to be one of the most important people in his life, or should I say, up until now.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. But yeah, once again, I want to thank you for your time as well. I feel like I could probably talk to you about this movie for 4 hours and just dig into the untold stories. But like I mentioned, we'll continue to share as it gets released, and hopefully streaming, VOD, all that. And I really look forward to your next project in the future.
Thank you, Sean, and you're very welcome. Thanks for having me on.
Hope you guys enjoyed that talk with Brian Vincent as much as I did. Was a little late posting this one around the Toronto dates of the film. Hopefully, if you were interested, you saw my Instagram stories I shared a bit. But if you are in the New York area, definitely go out and catch these screenings. Such a great film, and like I mentioned, we'll let you know if it gets released anywhere else and share some clips and all that on the Creative Imbalance socials. And before we go, like always, I gotta give a special thanks to all you legends on the Patreon page. First up, the co-producer Jeremy Hopkin of Hopkin Design, Amanda McKnight of Top 10 Nerd, Ryan Watkins of Ryan Radio, the wonderful Jenny Potter, the man Devin McBride, Ryan frickin' Campbell, Mike, my boy Ulio, my favorite soul singer Saber, and last but not least, Francis Coffer, aka my mom. If you want to shout out at the end of every episode and get these episodes raw and uncut right when I'm done the Zoom call, I take the file and I throw it on the Patreon page for you to watch immediately. You can go to patreon.com/the Creative Imbalance. And outside of all those incentives, you will go to bed at night knowing you're a badass motherfucker who supports independent media and forever have my thanks. And with that being said, I'm going to run away. We got more episodes for you around the corner, and we'll catch you next time. Cheers.